In this video, we're going to talk about basic HUD stats, but before we talk about basic HUD stats, we need to define what HUD means and what a HUD is. So HUD stands for a heads-up display, and in online poker, we use what is called a poker HUD, and this is what you see here on the screen. And what this is this is a graphical interface, and this is software that transparently overlays directly on top of your online poker client table. And what it does is it tracks both you and your opponent's hands and tendencies via data and statistical information in real time as you play. And so what this does is it takes this information, updates it within some sort of a database on your system depending upon the software and what it uses, and it outputs key HUD stat statistics on your opponents and also on yourself if you want to track your own stats. And this provides you key statistical information on how your opponents are playing. So what you see here are multiple different types of HUD stats. There are pre-flop HUD stats and there are post-flop HUD stats. And what we're going to do on the next slide is we're going to take a look at all these. So let's go ahead and let's take a look. So there are pre-flop stats and there are post-flop stats, and this is just going to be a high-level overview. I'm just going to give you a high-level overview of what these are. If you want more in-depth analysis in regards to HUD stats and various poker tracking software and so forth, take a look at my exploitative online poker course. So that one gives you the fundamentals of exploitative poker and specifically HUD stats. So with that said, let's take a look at the pre-flop stats, which is the top table. So the first stat is VPIP, which is voluntary put in pot, or some people say voluntarily put money in the pot. So this is whenever you're voluntarily putting money in the pot. So when aren't we voluntarily putting money in the pot? Well, when we're in the blinds, we're forced to put money in the pot, so that doesn't count. So whenever we're limping, whenever we're raising, whenever we're 3-betting, whenever we are making the decision to put money in the pot, that's going to go towards this VPIP stat. The PFR stat is the pre-flop raise stat, and just like its name implies, this is going to be the percentage of hands that we are raising as a pre-flop raise pre-flop. Now when I'm saying when we are raising, this is going to be a single raise pot. So somebody limps and we raise, that's going to be a PFR. If it's folded around to us, nobody's coming to the pot yet, and we open raise, that's going to be a PFR. Now on the other hand, when somebody raises and we re-raise, that's called a 3-bet. Because the blinds are the forced initial bet, the initial pre-flop raise is the second bet, and whenever we re-raise as a 3-bet, that's the third bet. So this is the percentage of hands that a player raises 3-bets the pre-flop when somebody has already raised within that pot. The next stat is a fold versus 3-bet, and I typically list it as FV3B, but you may see people listed as whatever you want. And in fact, with tools such as Poker Tracker and Hold'em Manager, you can actually eliminate these acronyms altogether, not to show, or you can list them as whatever you want. So this is the percentage of the hands that where somebody raises pre-flop, or if somebody open limps pre-flop and then somebody raises and then there's a 3-bet, when it comes back around to them when they fold to that 3-bet. So the percentage of times that a person, when they face a 3-bet and they fold, that's what the fold versus a 3-bet stat is. The next stat is the steal stat. So what is a steal? Well, a steal is when we open raise in late position with the primary goal of stealing the blinds. And this is going to be typically with HUD stat software. It's going to be if we're raising from the cutoff position, the button position, or the small blind. So if it's folded around to the cutoff and cutoff open raises as a PFR, that's going to count towards a PFR stat, and it's also going to count towards a steal stat. Same thing for the button and the small blind. Alright, so the last one is a fold versus a steal. And just like the fold versus 3-bet, this is whenever anybody faces an open raise from late position that is considered a steal and they fold. So the percentage of hands or the percentage of the time that they fold to a steal. And you're going to notice down here, let's take a look at these stats. So we have our VPIP here. So this is going to be VPIP. So this means that this person has a VPIP of 29%. Their PFR is here, so their pre-flop raise means that they're raising 20% of the time. Their 3-bet is here, is 12% 3-bet, so they are 3-betting 12% of the time, and here's their fold versus 3-bet. their steal, and fold versus steal. So whenever facing a 3-bet, they are folding 25% of the time. When they have an attempt to steal the blinds, they're stealing 34% of the time. And when they face a steal attempt, they are folding 61% of the time. Okay, so that's our pre-flop stats. Let me go ahead and get rid of all the highlighting, and now let's take a look at our basic post-flop stats. So we have our C-bet stat, which is our continuation bet. So what is a continuation bet? Well, a continuation bet is where somebody raises pre-flop, and then they follow up on the flop with a continuation bet. Now, there are multiple different types of continuation bet stats. There is a flop continuation bet stat, there's a turn continuation bet stat, and there's a river continuation bet stat. And you can break it down and look at each individual street if you want, but by default, with this one, we can just have it look at the flop, and that'll be fine for a lot of instances. But if you want to see how often somebody is betting on multiple different streets, we can do that as well. The next stat is going to be a fold versus a continuation bet. So just like its name implies, it's when somebody faces a continuation bet and they fold. So for example, let's say that under the gun open raises pre-flop, and then button calls the raise and everybody else folds, it goes to the flop. Under the gun decides to fire out a continuation bet. Now the action is on button. Button decides to fold. Well, that's going to be a fold versus a continuation bet. The next one is went to showdown. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about these two combined, is won at showdown. So these two go hand in hand. The went to showdown tells you how often a player is likely to go to showdown rather than try to bluff you. And the won money at showdown is how often they win at showdown. So we can take a look at these two combined, and if we see a player, if they're going to showdown a lot, that means that they're probably not bluffing. If somebody's not going to showdown that often, then it means they're probably bluffing a lot. Conversely, if somebody is going to showdown and they have a high percentage of won at showdown when they go to showdown, then we know when they are going to showdown, they're typically not bluffing. But if they do get to showdown and they don't win that often, that means that we can look at their HUD stats and say, oh, well, you know what? I don't have that strong of a hand, but this person is barely ever winning at showdown. So I'm going to make sure we get to showdown with a semi-decent hand. So that's our basic post-flop HUD stats, and you'll notice here that we only have 4 versus we have 6 for the pre-flop, and here's our stats here on the bottom line. So this opponent here, villain number 10, they are C-betting or continuation betting 67% of the time. When facing a continuation bet, they are folding 67% of the time, and when they go to showdown, they are winning 70% of the time, but they only go to showdown 24% of the time. So that's our basic HUD stats. Now, there's also this, you're going to see this typically, the pound sign. This is going to be the number of hands. And the sample size of hands is very important when it comes to HUD stats. And I actually didn't do a slide on this. But when it comes to HUD stats, we typically want to have a decent sample size on our opponents. So if we are utilizing HUD stats, and let's say we sit down at a table and it's a brand new table and we've never played with these opponents, well, in the first, I would say less than 50 hands, we probably want to ignore a majority of the HUD stats. There are going to be players where, based upon what they're doing, if they're really bad, we can get an idea of what they're doing. But a majority of the time, when it comes to statistical data such as HUD stats, we need a large sample size, just like we would in science with any sort of statistical data when we're doing any sort of analysis. So with a lot of these, we probably want to be, I would say, somewhere around 100 hands or more, and some of them even up to into 1,000 hands or more. So that's going to be our basic discussion on HUD stats. One other thing that I do want to say with HUD stats and utilizing some sort of a poker tracking software or utilizing HUDs altogether is that if you're new to the game, I would say it's probably not worth it to invest in poker tracking software and some sort of a HUD such as Hold'em Indicator or Poker Tracker 4 or Holder Manager very early on in your game, because I'd rather you focus on just playing solid poker without relying on HUD stats. What I found is if people end up purchasing some sort of poker tracking software such as Hold'em Indicator, which we're going to take a look at on the next video, is that they have an over tendency to really only utilize the HUD stats and use that to make a majority of their decisions, where they're not really paying attention to what's going on at the table. They're not taking good notes and everything else. So I'd rather people get in the habit of not using HUDs. So they're taking good notes, they're paying attention to what everybody's doing at the table, and then over time start to implement and utilize HUDs and start using HUD stats on top of all that combined. So anyways, that's going to conclude our lecture. If you have any questions, let me know. If not, thanks for watching. And in the next slide, like I said, we're going to do a live demonstration where I'm going to use one of the older HUD softwares that I used first off when I got into online poker, and that's Hold'em Indicator. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at that.